Okay, here we go. We're continuing with Chapter 4. This is session number 26. Chapter 4, The Illusions of the Ego. And we are on page 56 in the text, section number 2, The Ego and False Autonomy. Alrighty then. Jesus says, it is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past, because the past does not matter, and history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal, and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete. So, in all the classes that I had ever gone to with Dr. Wapnick in Roscoe, New York, someone inevitably would ask the question, why would the ego do this? How did the ego do this? Why would we do that? You know, how did this happen? And so he would refer to this passage, and he goes, where Jesus tells Helen, it's a reasonable question, you know, to wonder why or how. He said, but there's really no point in giving an answer. And Ken Water said, I'm not going to give you an answer you want or you'd like. Right? It's because there's no point in giving an answer in terms of the past, like, well, this is what happened, and because the same thing is going on in the present moment. The same exact thing is happening presently. We're making a choice. Do I align myself with the ego thought system, or do I align myself with the right mind, which leads me back to the awareness of God, which leads me back to that state of abstract thinking, right? Which is very threatening, as I said once before, to think, the proper state of mind is abstract thought. It's hard to even dwell on it, because how do you even picture it? Because we are specifics. We are into specifics, okay? Abstract thought applies to knowledge. That's why Jesus uses the word knowledge to represent the state of heaven, the state of our original existence, all right, where we know, we just know. Abstract thought applies to knowledge because knowledge is completely impersonal and examples are irrelevant to its understanding. Right? Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete. Once we choose to align ourselves with the ego thought system, we choose the world of perception. Right? We start to perceive because there's duality. There's automatically other. There's me and other. Right? Now everything gets perceived and judged. You have to look and see, what is that? And is it threatening? So perception goes on, and it's happening right in this very moment. Right? Perception, however, is always specific and therefore quite concrete. So he says, go ahead, ask the question, but you're not going to like the answer. That's all. All right? He says, why bother with trying to figure out what happened when it's happening in this moment? So paragraph 2, everyone makes an ego or a self for himself, right, which is subject to enormous variation because of its instability. He also makes an ego for everyone else he perceives, which is equally variable. Their interaction is a process that alters both, because they were not made by or with the unalterable. It is important to realize that this alteration can and does occur as readily when the interaction takes place in the mind as when it involves physical proximity. Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. There could be no better example than the ego is only an idea and not a fact. So he says, look, you make an ego for yourself and you make an ego for everyone else. Right? Everyone else that we perceive. And he says, and the variations are just unlimited, so to speak. All right? We're always, changing our mind and thinking about this and that. The interaction is a process that alters both when we start interacting with people. Right? Because they're not made by the unalterable. You're not made by the consistent. The ego is not made by the consistent God, so to speak. Right? The consistent source of all being. And it's important to realize that this alteration can and does occur the same way, whether you're thinking about another ego or you're actually standing in front of them. Right? You're in physical proximity. He says the same process is going on. Right? Thinking about another ego is as effective in changing relative perception as is physical interaction. There could be no better example than the ego is only an idea and not a fact. All right? And I mean, you think about it. You could be thinking of someone and having this whole movie play out in your head. What they said last time that you saw them, what they did, how you reacted, how they reacted, the faces they made, the words they chose, the tone of their voice, all these variables, all right, are leading to my interpretation of that other ego. All right, and he says that, and it just always changes. It's always altered. Whether they're there standing in front of you in the same room with you, or you're just thinking of them. I mean, you could think of people from your past whom you no longer see, and maybe some of them are gone, and we can have this full-length movie going on in our mind about, what these people have done, what they've said, and how they looked, and, all kinds of things. And we interpret that, we perceive it. So he says that's a good example of how the ego is just an idea. It's in the mind, right? Because it's so alterable. And he says your own state of mind, in paragraph 3, your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego was made. Right? When you threw knowledge away, it is as if you never had it. This is so apparent that one need only recognize it to see that it does happen. If this occurs in the present, why is it surprising that it occurred in the past? Surprise is a reasonable response to the unfamiliar, though hardly to something that occurs with such persistence. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now. So you shouldn't be surprised, although you should, you will be, because that's the way the ego works right now. it's, that was going on. I've always been doing that. Right? And he says your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego is made. Then he says, when you threw knowledge away, so in that moment, when the tiny mad idea arose, there was that moment when we had a choice to make. All right? Do I want the allure of the ego, which says you could be independent, you don't need to take this stuff from God. All right? He never recognizes you. He doesn't know you. All right? Come on, we could be separate. We could do the same things that he does. Right? And or we get the right mind, the return to our relationship with God, which really says nothing. It just, as they say, the Holy Spirit just looks and waits. All right? Forgiveness looks and waits and judges not. So the Holy Spirit just sits there going, yeah, well, And then we make that choice in that moment. And he says, we constantly do that. And he says, that's when we turned our back on knowledge, when we threw it away, as he says here. All right? And then that's when the dissociation happens, when I split off from who I really am, and I choose the ego, right? The dissociation happens, and I forget that I once had knowledge. So he says, so it's as if you never had it. And that knowledge is the awareness of my relationship with my Creator and my function in that abstract existence, which is the same as my Creator's, and which is extending everything, all right? Extending love, abundance, bliss, happiness, all those words that we use because we're specifics, all right? Trying to describe a non-specific existence. But that's what we did in our original function, was just spreading the joy. All right? We extended it. The invulnerability, the lack of fear. All right? And he'll tell us numerous times, that continues because this is illusory, this ego existence, even though we think, oh, I made this big mistake. I chose the ego thought system. The sin. And after the sin comes the guilt and the fear. Oh, what have I done? Oh my God, God's going to get me. And we take those three lovely little companions with us into the wrong mind, so to speak, that split part of the mind. And then all of a sudden we're so fearful that God is going to come get us. God's going to find you if you stay in your mind. Right? Let's go. Let's get out of here. And we use that powerful mind that we have to project out of, or what we think is out of the mind. We make ourselves believe that we're projecting out of the mind into the universe, right? With all its myriad planets and solar systems, and as Carl Sagan would say, millions and millions of planets. All right, it's the equivalent in the Garden of Eden of all of a sudden realizing, oh, we're naked, and God's coming to get us when we run into the trees to hide. All right, this is a good story. It's a good metaphor on what happened metaphysically in the Course's mythology, right? When we chose the ego, we felt immediately like we did something wrong, and now our Creator, we're automatically projecting anger onto the Creator, right? When it was a result of anger at not being recognized that created this nutty situation. All right, so now I'm projecting, oh, he's angry at me, he's going to get me. And we have to run, we have to leave. And Jesus is saying, why, why bother being so locked into the past? When did that happen? Why did that happen? It's because you're doing it right now. And at any moment during our day, we could stop and take inventory. Oh, what am I thinking? What was I thinking as I was walking down the street? All right. Was I thinking, oh, here's somebody walking toward me? All right. Was I, prepping myself, being defensive, or because I'm looking at an other, and I need to do what egos do. I need to assess the situation. And read that word assessment as judge. I need to judge. Right? And I'm very quickly at assessing the situation. All right? Because of this ego world that I have entered in my fever, this is the way it goes. All right? So any moment of walking down the street, you could see, what are my thoughts? Oh, I was thinking about, Aunt Ethel, and what she said to me when I was 11, and I was bringing up anger, right? Bringing up resentment. Because it doesn't matter if the ego is standing there in front of you or not. It's in the mind. And there's those thoughts, they're racing through the mind. And we can at that moment say, oh, obviously, I'm in the ego thought system. Because I'm having a reaction. I'm having a reaction, whether I'm angry or extremely happy. Something is making me very happy. It's also an ego reaction, all right? And we can take our own inventory and say, oh, I must be listening to the ego. The ego is my teacher. The ego is my guide. It's telling me what life is all about, right? And how to fix it, so to speak. It's always fixing it, okay? Because it's never quite right, So, it says, so your own state of mind is a good example of how the ego is made. Right? When you threw knowledge away, it was as if you never had it. So we walked down the street as if we never had knowledge, as if knowledge is not all around us. As if knowledge is not the milieu in which we exist. Like the fish lives in the water. We exist in the knowledge, but we've turned our back on it, so it's as if we threw it away. And now we're listening to the monkey mind, as the Buddhists would say. We're listening to the ego. The monkeys are making a lot of noise up there. Right? So, let's go to paragraph 4. But let's just end paragraph 3 once again, reiterating that last sentence. But do not forget that the mind need not work that way, even though it does work that way now. All right? It doesn't have to always be assessing, judging, looking, reacting, right? It doesn't always have to be that way, right? Even though it's that way now. Right? Once again, Jesus is reminding us that there is a better way. There's another way of perceiving the world, and from that better way of perceiving, we rise above it, and eventually become aware of our existence in the abstract realm of knowledge. So he says in paragraph 4, think of the love of animals for their offspring and the need they feel to protect them. Right? This is because they regard them as part of themselves. No one dismisses something he considers part of himself. You react to your ego much as God does to his creations, with love, protection, and charity. Your reactions to the self you made are not surprising. In fact, they resemble in many ways how you will one day react to your own real creations, which are as timeless as you are. The question is not how you respond to the ego, but what you believe you are. Belief is an ego function, and as long as your origin is open to belief, you are regarding it from an ego viewpoint. When teaching is no longer necessary, you will merely know God. Right? Belief that there is another way of perceiving is the loftiest idea of which the ego thinking is capable. That is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the self, with a capital S. Right? So when we say there must be a better way, right? So belief that there is another way of perceiving, right? It's like I can't be angry at everybody, right? Like I once remember saying to my wonderful spiritual teacher, Emily Andrews, I was so exasperated one Saturday morning, sitting, waiting for a class, and the drive over there was just, I mean, for an early Saturday morning, it was filled with road rage, right? And I finally sat down on the couch and I said, Emily, it can't be everybody. I mean, it can't be everybody's an idiot, right? Everybody's, just so stupid that they don't know how to drive. And it's so stupid that they don't wait to cross the street at the right point. I said, it can't be everybody. And she just smiled at me. And that's that's kind of a step forward in thinking, wait, there has to be a different way of looking at everybody. Right? What's my part in this? What's going on here? Why am I, and you realize you're projecting, that's the ego's thing. You project onto the other egos, right? So in our mind, they're the stupid ones, right? They don't know how to cross the street, they don't know how to drive, right? They don't obey the laws, whatever it is, right? So, but it's just belief that there's another way of looking at this, all right, is the loftiest idea of which the ego thinking is capable. All right, because the ego doesn't want us to stop thinking this way. So the highest idea we could have within the ego thought system is, maybe there's a different way of seeing this. Okay? And then the ego starts to crack and be threatened. Okay. And he says the reason why that's the very loftiest idea is because it contains a hint of recognition that the ego is not the true self. All right? So it contains a hint that there's something beyond what this specific is experiencing. Right? Bumping into other specifics. So, paragraph 5. Undermining the ego's thought system must be perceived as painful, even though this is anything but true. Right? Babies scream in rage if you take away a knife or scissors, although they may well harm themselves if you do not. In this sense, you are still a baby. You have no sense of real self-preservation and are likely to decide that you need precisely what would hurt you the most. Yet whether or not you recognize it now, you have agreed to cooperate in an effort to become more harmless and helpful, to become both harmless and helpful, attributes that must go together. Your attitudes, even toward this, are necessarily conflicted, because all attitudes are ego-based. This will not last. Be patient a while, and remember that the outcome is as certain as God. All right? Throughout the text, Jesus will constantly repeat this in different ways. Once the journey is begun, right, the outcome is certain. Right? And he says, be patient and remember that the outcome is as certain as God. All right? So we think, oh, there must be a different way of perceiving. And he says, be patient, and you'll, because it's definite. Once you have that thought and you're on your way, you're on your way. Just be patient. Right? And he says, and it's a process of looking at the ego, all right, and then deciding, no, I don't want that. All right? And he says, and you might still be reacting like a baby. Oh, I need that. Give that back to me. So he says, all right, take it. But he says, in other places, he'll remind us, you don't know what's in your best interest. All right? And he says, sometimes you want things that just aren't good for you. All right? Really? That's an understatement. All right? But the idea is to look and ask. Ask that capital S self. All right? Ask your friend, Jesus, and I encourage you to look at him as a friend, all right? As a brother, however you want to see him. All right? He's just a brother on the path who's very eager to escort us home. All right? All right. That reminds me of the lyric from the Grateful Dead, if I knew the way, I would take you home. Well, Jesus knows the way. And he's going to walk us down the road. And he assures us at one point that it will be like walking through a beautiful garden on a sunny day. All right? If we just allow him to guide us and to help us to change our perceptions. All right? Because he says, dissolving the ego, undermining the ego, all right, is perceived as painful. He goes, it doesn't have to be. But it's perceived as painful. We go, no, I have to give up this. I have to give up that. No, we're going to take this away from me. You're going to take my cheeseburgers. All right? But it's not that. It's not a giving up of anything. Right? So it doesn't have to be painful. Right? It's looking at whatever it is that we want in the ego thought system, or we think we need in the ego thought system, and asking for our perception to be changed, our interpretation of it to be changed. And eventually we just say, oh, I really don't need that. I don't want it, right? I just don't want it. It's unnecessary now. It's meaningless. It used to have such meaning to me. All right? And so the objects, the toys of the ego are relinquished. Right? They're just put aside, and we walk away from them. We're saying, no, I don't want that anymore. Right? And that becomes the painless way of undermining the ego thought system. He says, and you'll become both harmless and helpful. All right? And he says, even though you're conflicted about that, and you could see, you know, what, I'm harmless? You know, I remember I was working in a restaurant, all right, and the waitresses, you gotta love them because they work so hard, and they're talking and chattering, and I hear they're talking about me. And the one waitress goes, "Oh, Kevin, he's harmless." And I remember taking that as an insult. I said, what are you talking about? I don't know what, you know, it was as if, you know, like I was a nobody or whatever. I wasn't a man, you know? But that's what he's talking about. He says, your attitudes toward this are necessarily conflicted, all right? Now this was, I don't know, 30 years ago, right? Just as I had started to read the course and study with Emily, all right? And my friend Terry from Long Island, she was the one that introduced me to this course, all right? And I'm forever grateful for that, all right? But you could see how you're conflicted about becoming harmless. What? Right? You'll see it differently, all right? You'll be not only harmless, you'll be helpful, all right? As my friend, the Irishman from the Bronx, Bob Mulvey, would say, it's okay to show them the sword. You don't have to use it. But I'm digressing into memory lane here, all right, when actually the same things are going on in the present, all right? So, he says these attitudes toward relinquishing, undermining the ego, letting them go, he says your attitudes are conflicted, right? Because attitudes are ego-based. And he says, but this won't last, right? With your dedication to seeing correctly, these things won't last. He goes, because the outcome is as certain as God. And the outcome is knowledge, right? After, it will surpass the peacefulness with which we will walk through this world, right? A state which the Course will refer to as the real world, when we walk through the world actually harmless and helpful and understanding everything. Then there's also another step into the realm of knowledge, right? And where we say, oh, right, I don't need the specifics anymore. And he says, that's as certain as God, all right? That is certain that you will attain that because you want it, all right? He says, in the meantime, you're as protective of your ego thought system as, you know, the mama blue jay is protective of her eggs and her little ones that have hatched. Do not mess with the blue jays, let me tell you that. They're not having it, all right? And all the animals, they will protect their young, all right? And so you protect your ego projections, you protect the ego thought system, just like that. All right, so you know, it's hard to give it up. We think, oh, somebody's taking it away. I'm sacrificing. It's not like that. All right, the idea is to look and then just judge. Say, well, do I really need that? Do I want the outcome of that ego judgment there? All righty then. Paragraph 6 on page 58. Only those who have a real and lasting sense of abundance can be truly charitable. This is obvious when you consider what is involved. To the ego, to give anything implies that you will have to do without it. When you associate giving with sacrifice, you give only because you believe that you are somehow getting something better, and can therefore do without the thing that you give. Giving to get is an inescapable law of the ego, which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos. It is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. Its whole perception of other egos as real is only an attempt to convince itself that it is real. Self-esteem, in ego terms, means nothing more than the ego has deluded itself into accepting its reality and is therefore temporarily less predatory. This self-esteem is always vulnerable to stress, a term which refers to any perceived threat to the ego's existence. Right? The ego literally lives by comparisons. Equality is beyond its grasp, and charity becomes impossible. The ego never gives out of abundance, because it was made as a substitute for it. That is why the concept of getting arose in the ego's thought system. Appetites are getting mechanisms, right, representing the ego's need to confirm itself. This is as true of body appetites as it is of the so-called higher ego needs. Emotional needs, issues, okay? Body appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind, which has become completely confused about what is really possible. So, body appetites are not physical in origin. The ego regards the body as its home and tries to satisfy itself through the body. But the idea that this is possible is a decision of the mind. Right? And it all goes back to the one problem, one solution. The decision of the mind was to believe that I separated from my source, that I separated from abundance. I turned my back on everything. Now I'm lacking something. So that's the original thought, the original impetus for appetites. All right, I'm lacking something. So I have an appetite for it. I want it. I'm hungry for it. For whatever it is. You know? So that's why he's saying body appetites are not physical in origin. Okay? Just think about these things. Don't become too rigid. All right? But this is the way it goes. Everything is the result of the choice to believe I'm separated. I'm separated from love. I'm separated from abundance. I'm separated from safety. All those things. Right? So, and he says the idea that the ego never gives anything out of charity. Right? That's why when Jesus is talking about being charitable, he's never talking about specifics and things that are in form. He's talking about he can be charitable because he is aware of the abundance in which he exists and that it's never ending. It doesn't diminish because I extend the abundance or the abundance is extended through me. It doesn't diminish. Love doesn't diminish. All right, it's a word we use in our situations here. All right? Love doesn't diminish. It's always there. All right? But in the ego thought system, if I give something, that means I have less of it, whatever it is. You're going to share your sandwich. You're going to give somebody a bite or a half, or whatever. That means you have less. And it says the ego does that, but it likes to make bargains. What am I going to get back for this? All right, I'll donate money to the church. All right, what do I get back for that? Well, you get probably get some good behavior points taken off your purgatory sentence or something, All right, but the ego is always, giving to get. I donate to this and that. What do I get back? Oh, you get the prestige. Everyone says, whoa, what a generous and nice person. Whatever. It's always like that. And it comes down to the littlest thing, So the ego always gives to get. It's an inescapable law of the ego, right? Which always evaluates itself in relation to other egos, right? All right. So it is therefore continually preoccupied with the belief in scarcity that gave rise to it. So the belief in scarcity gave rise to the ego. Now I turn my back on everything. Now I have nothing. All right, and remember in this section, Jesus' his first real big introduction to the ego and how it works, what its thoughts are. Okay. So, in paragraph 8. This is the ego believes it is completely on its own, which is merely another way of describing how it thinks it originated. Right? I separated from God. I made myself. Right? This is such a fearful state that it can only turn to other egos and try to unite with them in a feeble attempt at identification, or attack them in an equally feeble show of strength. It is not free, however, to open the premise to question, because the premise is its foundation. All right? The ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own. The ego's ceaseless attempts to gain the spirit's acknowledgement and thus establish its own existence are useless. Spirit, in its knowledge, is unaware of the ego. It does not attack it. It merely cannot conceive of it at all. While the ego is unequally aware of spirit, it does perceive itself as being rejected by something greater than itself. This is why self-esteem in ego terms must be delusional. The creations of God do not create myths, although creative effort can be turned into mythology. It can do so, however, only under one condition. What it makes is then no longer creative. Myths are entirely perceptual, and so ambiguous in form and characteristically good and evil in nature, then the most benevolent of them is not without fear, not without fearful connotations. All right? So even in myths, all right, there's some fearful connotations because someday the myth ends. All right? So the ego, the main thrust of this paragraph here is that the ego believes it's on its own. Okay? And that's a very fearful situation. All right? The ego thinks it's on its own, and as, to use the words Jesus will use later, it creates a condition that is uncertain, lonely, and in constant fear. So what the ego does is that it gathers groups, other egos, to reaffirm itself, right? To reassure itself, right? Or it decides to attack other egos, right? As a show of strength, right? You can't hurt me. I'll get you, it's just a crazy thought system, all right? So the ego's mind, the ego is the mind's belief that it is completely on its own, right? And it is ceaseless attempts to get spirit's attention, all right? But spirit is unaware of ego. All right? And that's what made the ego angry, trying to get spirit's attention. Right? And it said, all right, forget you. I'll go do this on my own. Right? But it's like the existence in heaven is unaware of the ego's nuttiness, the ego's fevered dream. All right? So, and this is why he says self-esteem in the ego's terms. It has to be delusional. The ego's always trying to puff itself up. Look at me. I'm the winner. Right? I have more than. I'm better than. I'm smarter than. Right? I won the contest for whatever. Always trying to get that self-esteem, And granted, now in this ego existence, you could see how for a while it's necessary, all right, to make your way through the ego forest here, but then you get to the point where you start questioning things and you realize, oh, I no longer need to puff up my own esteem here. All right. So paragraph 9, page 59. Myths and magic are closely associated, since myths are usually related to ego origins and magic to the powers the ego ascribes to itself. So when Jesus used the word magic, it's anything that the ego uses, right? It's a power, anything that's outside of the mind. The ego makes these things to get solutions to problems, right? So myths and magic are closely associated. Mythological systems generally include some account of the creation and associate this with its particular form of magic. The so-called battle for survival is only the ego's struggle to preserve itself and its interpretation of its own beginning. This beginning is usually associated with physical birth because it is hard to maintain that the ego existed before that point in time. The more religiously ego-oriented may believe that the soul existed before and will continue to exist after a temporary lapse into ego life. Some even believe that the soul will be punished for this lapse. However, salvation does not apply to spirit, which is not in danger and does not need to be salvaged. Right? He's saying this is just an ego myth. Right? And, the fall, the creation of Adam. and Adam and Eve and all the whole thing, and and you could find prehistoric tribes and people that still live in the deep recesses of jungles, away from society. They'll have their origins, their mythological origins of how they came to be. Right? And he says, and even some people believe, they're cool. Well, the soul existed before it had this journey into being a body, all right? And then the soul will exist afterwards, all right? But he says, then they add on that you're allowed to be punished for that little trip into the body, And so you have to be saved while you're here, And meanwhile, Jesus says, well, look, the spirit doesn't need to be saved. The spirit is always a constant. It's just a constant. It always is. All right? And we're the ones running around in the dream, so to speak. All right? Making stuff up, as they say. All right? He says, the spirit does not need to be salvaged. Paragraph 10, salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, but which must be achieved before one-mindedness is restored. So the salvation is the right-mindedness. It's going to the right mind. It's having the perception changed. As we said before, of course we use the term the real world. So you're still perceiving, but your perception has been corrected. Right? And then there's So that's a right-minded perception, but there's another step into the one-mindedness, right? Into the remembering that, oh yes, we're all just a part of one mind, right? And that one-mindedness is restored. So right-mindedness leads to the next step automatically, because right perception is uniformly without attack, and therefore wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment and is laid aside accordingly. Right. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. Its direction is always automatic, because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. So if I've laid down the ego thought system, I've laid it aside, I'm now in right-mindedness, right? It says the direction now is automatic because of the thought system to which I am adhering, right? So he says it cannot be emphasized too often that correcting perception is merely a temporary expedient, right? It's the first thing we want to do is correct our perception, right? But it's only a temporary remedy, right? Because eventually we want to get to the one-mindedness, the awareness, the knowledge, right? It is necessary, that is, correcting perception is necessary only because misperception is a block to knowledge, while accurate perception is a stepping stone toward it. Right? The whole value of right perception lies in the inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary. Okay? This removes the block entirely. So, right perception, we keep asking, help me to see correctly in every situation, all right? Until we're moving forward, until we see everything correctly, right? And then we're moving in that direction toward remembering who we are, right? The whole value of right perception lies in its inevitable realization that all perception is unnecessary. So we finally realize, oh, I don't need specifics. I don't need perception, because there is no other. We realize that now. There's only the one, the oneness of which I am part. I am that. Right? And that, so right perception removes the blocks to that awareness. And you may ask how this is possible as long as you appear to be living in this world. That's a reasonable question. You must be careful, however, that you really understand it. Who is the you who are living in this world? Who is the you who is living in this world? Spirit is immortal, and immortality is a constant state. It is true now, as it ever was, or ever will be, because it implies no change at all. It is not a continuum, nor is it understood by being compared to an opposite. Knowledge never involves comparisons. This is its main difference from everything else the mind can grasp. Knowledge never involves comparisons. Right? And our state of spirit, our true state, always is. Right? It's immortal. And immortality is a constant state. Right? There is no interruption. Right? And that's as true now as it ever was or ever will be, because it implies no change at all. And that's the state to which we aspire, so to speak, all right? By having our perceptions changed. As Jesus said earlier, he says, I came here to start from the bottom up, all right? So we begin where we are, all right? Whatever perceptions we become aware of, oh, am I seeing that through the ego? I'd like to see it correctly, please. All right? And you could say that any way you want. All right? Someone asked Ken, is there some kind of prayer or something? And Ken said, well, can you say help? All right? So I realize I'm caught in the ego thought system. It's always an uncomfortable result to be thinking with the ego. And so I say, I want to have my perception changed. I'm contacting my right mind, right, where the symbols of Jesus and Holy Spirit exist, right? And Jesus as our brother and guide and companion, help me to see this correctly. And by doing that, I'm laying the ego aside, bit by bit, all right? Or so it seems, until I get to the state of complete right-mindedness, right? And then it's just a brief moment before I rejoin the oneness, or not rejoin it, but just become aware of never having left it, so to speak. All right? All righty then. So, just a little bit more about the ego, okay? And we'll end it here, and we'll continue with the next session, which will be entitled Love Without Conflict. All right, wouldn't that be nice? Okay. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.